Good evening and welcome. My name is Biljana Ćirić and I'm the founder of What Could Should Curating Do Curatorial course. Tonight we are very honored that we have Matt Pecker, the Director of EVA International, Ireland's Biennial of Contemporary Art, as our speaker and the mentor of our curatorial course. And I'm grateful to Museum of Contemporary Art for this collaboration. The presentation by Matt Pecker will evolve around EVA Ireland's longest running organization of contemporary visual art. Established in 1977 to stimulate visual arts in the Midwest region of Ireland, it since developed as a model of inviting international guest curator to do exhibitions of work by Irish and international artists. EVA adopted the biennial model in 2012, which continues till today. The most recent edition of 38 EVA International was created by Inti Guerrero. That took place in the 6 venues in Limerick, Dublin in spring-summer 2018. Drawing on a number of specific episodes of EVA's 40 years anniversary, the recent appointed Director of EVA International will present example how EVA was considered and responded to broader cultural and political changes, both within Ireland and internationally. These examples include EVA's presentations of the artists' campaign to repeal the 8th Amendment during the 2018 referendum campaign to overrule restrictive abortion legislations in Ireland, and recurring address the partition between Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And a few words about Matt Pecker. He's a director of EVA International, as I said, Ireland's Biennial of Contemporary Art. Previously, he was director of CCA Centre for Contemporary Arts, Derry, London, Derry, between 2014 and 2017. He was associate director of a Trademark project. Trainiac project between 2013 and 2016, curator of exhibitions and project Louis Glaxman's gallery between 2008 and 2013. And as an independent curator, he has curated numerous exhibitions in Ireland and internationally. He was also part of the selection committee for British representation at the Venice Biennial in 2017. And he has written for numerous magazine journals, including Frieze, Kaleidoscope, Concreta, and others. So, Matt, thank you for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation, which is both thrilling and challenging for me on a number of counts. One is I'm relatively new in the role as EVA's director. I've been in the position for about 18 months, and I have the job now of trying to represent its 40-year history to you all. The other reason why the invitation is a bit challenging is that my role is a director-CEO position rather than a curating position. And so I spend most of my time not curating as such, but trying to really figure out how to apply curating in ways that are practical and make sense within a local context and with cognition to the audiences that we're trying to reach and some of our kind of broader educational strategies. So I think it's kind of important to say that actually from the very, very beginning, because I feel very much invested in those kind of in the broader apparatus actually of what a biennial does, over and beyond what a curator does. And one reflection I have is that so much of the discourse around the biennial has been driven by curators actually, rather than driven by biennial directors or producers or many of the people that actually make them operate kind of at a sort of grassroots level. And so yeah, I'm kind of interested actually in sort of challenging that, or in a way responding to the discourse a little bit as someone that's in a kind of CEO role. I don't have a kind of scripted lecture to present to you. I have a number of slides which I'm going to talk to and talk through, and I will do my best to make sense. If you have any questions or seek clarification through the course of this presentation, then please raise your hand. Okay. So EVA is a remarkable project. It's 40 years in existence, not always as a biennial. That really only started happening from 2012 onwards. It's a remarkable project on a number of counts, and the main one being that in 1977, when EVA was first founded, it's kind of quite difficult to describe just how little visual arts infrastructure there was in Ireland at the time. The Irish Museum of Modern Art didn't open until 1996. There really wasn't any infrastructure at all. There were, of course, artists working away and a few different collectives, but organisationally it was really very, very limited. There are a number of ways of talking about EVA's history. The easiest one is just to present a list of famous curators that have curated the editions from 1979, when the first international curator was invited. But of course, it's not the only history of EVA, and one of the reasons I'm involved with the project is actually because I'm interested in the way that those curatorial histories coincide with broader social and cultural histories within the country. And it's a history that's also coincided with the boom in the biennial. It's a history that's coincided with the boom in curatorial practice and the kind of awareness of curatorial practice, as well as at a kind of national political level. It's the Good Friday Agreement happened in the middle of this process. Ireland has gone from being a very, very poor country, as it was in the mid-70s, through the kind of Celtic Tiger boom period in the early noughties, to now kind of levelling off, more or less, as a reasonably wealthy country within Western Europe. So all of those changes are somehow sort of built into the history of the project. In this slide, I've also included some of the crazy logos that were used at various points in time to brand the organisation. And this is also something that I'm kind of curious about and interested in from an organisational perspective, is just how much of the biennial was bestowed or deferred to the appointment of a guest curator, and it really left the organisation itself with very, very, very little identity. So this identity chopped and changed and was really very adaptable according to the vision of each guest curator. So that's something that I'll come back to later in the presentation. It's something that I'm kind of interested in addressing and actually sort of establishing as a more kind of solid basis for the organisation. So just to give you some really broad context, Limerick is Ireland's third most popular city. It's just marked with the red flag on Google Maps there, in the Midwest region of Ireland. It's so it's an important context nationally. Internationally, it's not so famous. It's famous for Angela's Ashes. I'm not sure if you've seen that. It's a film that was based on the book by Frank McCourt, which was a true story of his life, but it kind of serves up all of the cliches of the city and of Ireland. It's a story of kind of misery and poverty and an oppressive church and patriarchy. There is in Limerick an Angela's Ashes museum, and you can do walking tours around some of the scenes that are represented in the film. Limerick is also famous internationally, of course, for the airport. Shannon Airport is a transatlantic stopover. And that in itself is kind of curious. The American military still have a kind of presence there. and the airport is offered to the military for the American military for European stopovers with much controversy and protest. The airport was also the world's first duty-free as part of a economic strategy that was developed by the Irish government in the 50s. So it's a place that has been sort of subject to quite a lot of investment and experimentation in those investments. It's a city, and I'll go on to this because it's relevant to Inti's Biennial that he curated this year. It was a place of the first piece of civil engineering that the new Irish state undertook in the mid-20s, which was a hydroelectric dam, cost a fifth of the state budget, and it was designed to basically electrify the whole country. All of that was invested in the Limerick region. In terms of its institutional ecology, there's not much there. There's a local municipal gallery. There's a couple of small project spaces. Excuse me. Can I get some more water?
Yes, of course.
And there's and there's also a small art school. And in the last 5 years, there's actually quite an interesting development of the film industry that's actually that's now in the Shannon Free Zone, this economic investment area in Limerick. They've kind of occupied a number of large-scale premises within the Free Zone, and they're beginning to make HBO films and that kind of stuff. And that's made all sorts of difference, actually, in a very practical sense, in terms of the organisational capacities of EVA, in terms of production resources and that kind of stuff. EVA, I mean, as I said, I've been in the job 18 months, and so I'm quite new to telling the story of the project, and new to some of its histories. I'm only 40 years old myself, so I don't even know really what 40 years even means. But what's true in going back through the catalogues is it did not begin like with a radical flame. It was not, it didn't begin with students trying to develop something with a kind of punkish energy in the way that so many institutions and project spaces began in that period. It began much more conservatively. Thanks very much. Much more conservatively. And here on the screen is a cover of the catalogue that was produced. There's some artwork that was included as part of the exhibition. And its motives were really, really simple. They were basically to provide the public an opportunity to see an exhibition that wouldn't otherwise be available to them in the region. And that in itself, that kind of logic of providing something exceptional by introducing something exceptional that in turn is going to stimulate that local context, I think is a very kind of provincial logic. It's a provincial topology that I think that kind of remained in place actually through a lot of EVA's life, and I think in fairness was a real limiter to its ongoing growth. So a lot of the work that was exhibited in the 1977 edition was all through open submission. Artists from Ireland were asked to submit works for consideration, and then prizes were given out along disciplinary channels of graphics and sculpture and that kind of thing. So my first impulses when I saw the 1977 catalogue and was rummaging around the early editions of the project were kind of actually one of disappointment, because I was looking for something that might kind of have the energy or the kind of precursor of like the contemporary art world that we recognise ourselves in today. But instead I found work like this, work that didn't respond to the kind of the situation in the north. It didn't respond to Ireland's economic limits at the time. Instead, it was kind of incredibly conservative stylistically and in terms of intent. But at the same time, I kind of think it's important that we kind of face up to this as an organisation and deal with it as a reality rather than try and sort of retroactively, think of ourselves differently. We're kind of like a punk organisation in reverse. We started off conservatively, and as time has gone on, we've become more empowered actually to be experimental and to change the modes in which we work. The early editions of EVA are kind of haunted by this sense of by this lack of confidence, lack of cultural confidence, which I think has to be understood in terms of Ireland's colonial or post-colonial circumstances. Ireland broke free of England in 1921 through quite a messy process of revolution. But because of its kind of ethnic proximity to the UK, because of the period of British occupation in Ireland, I mean, we're talking about 800 years, that Ireland's independence was one that meant Ireland's independence did not bring about new institutions. It basically just meant a shift in the administration of those same institutions. And I think for a lot of Ireland's life as an independent country, it's had to deal with that schism, that kind of post-colonial schism. And that's sort of reflected perhaps in the conservatism of the work that I described in my previous slide. Perhaps it's reflected in the way that in this kind of provincial logic of seeking to do something that would introduce to the region something exceptional and something from outside that would then stimulate the region. I think it's taken actually most of EVA's life as an organisation to shake a lot of that off. This was an interesting kind of moment in 1980. So this is the second year in which EVA decides strategically to appoint someone like an international curator to come and select the work through open submission. And the way that I like this image of Patrick Ireland, Brian O'Doherty sort of sitting amongst these paintings with a cup of tea. And the way it would literally work is that art was like deposited in a village hall, and he would literally walk through it and make a selection. I mean, it was just such a basic process. But I think it's interesting looking at some of the statements that were made around these editions, the language that's used around the selection process, and some of the kind of anxiety that begins to emerge through the statements of these curators, or adjudicators as they were known at the time. And it's an anxiety of selection, and it's anxiety of feeling that the selection process is somehow inadequate, or it does not do justice to either the artist or to the local context. There's a sense of implication in addressing a country that is still picking up its cultural confidences. And that, I think, is certainly true of Brian O'Doherty's 1980 exhibition. He himself, as this slide makes clear, was as many of you will know, he was an Irish-born artist who really made his name in New York as a writer and broadcaster, most famous for the Inside the White Cube series of essays that are now very much part of the horizon of exhibition practice and exhibition thinking. But he was very much a kind of a returning hero, and obviously needs to be seen within the kind of the logic of the Irish diaspora that is, again, part of this kind of post-colonial condition and this post-colonial mindset of Ireland at the time. He famously changed his name to Patrick Ireland in 1972 as protests of British occupation in Northern Ireland. I should say at this point that, so we're like 3, 4, 5 years into this into EVA as an open call prize-giving initiative developed by a local committee and then inviting an international person to make that selection. It it was throughout its life open to artists from the north, and that shouldn't be kind of underestimated, overstated, in that there were effectively two different countries with two different funding mechanisms and two different artistic infrastructures. The north obviously being part of the UK and the south being the Republic. But EVA made itself available to artists from the north throughout its history in a way that artists from the south were not often included into similar initiatives in the north. So as the years rolled on, the kind of pattern repeats itself, but the kind of curators become more notable and more famous, and they begin to kind of develop the organisation and some of the ambitions of this organisation. But they're still haunted, I mean, I'm repeating the same point, they're kind of haunted by this sense of Ireland's provincialism or its lack of cultural confidence. And I think this statement from Rudy Fuchs is just so interesting and telling in a way. I mean, he talks about World War II as a sort of benchmark for for this term of international art, which within an Irish context didn't mean anything because Ireland was neutral in World War II. So he begins with this like non-reference that doesn't make any sense in the local context. And he talks about international art and Ireland's sort of struggle to kind of recognise itself within international art, and then ultimately resigns to the fact that he tries to seek artists working in international modes. So I think all of this process of assessment, this process of judgment, this process of inviting in an independent curator, kind of kept and sustained the limited horizons for art in Ireland at that time. I mean, this is another example that I particularly like somehow. This is 1991, and Germano Salon, the Italian curator, who in the 1991 catalogue actually produced the essay in Italian. I mean that itself is like hugely significant because it obviously indicates the kind of audience and readership that he was prioritizing over an Irish audience, and it wouldn't be until Coyo's Biennial in 2016 that the catalogue was made available in Irish. So some of what I'm feeling when I'm going through this archive of EVA's history is a sense of sort of tragedy and missed opportunity, a sense of its like post-colonial anxiety, its lack of confidence, and that the organisation is just a sort of it's a kind of vessel really for other people's ideas. And those invited others were often frustrated by the lack of resources that were given to them. They were often frustrated by the lack of work that they were able to select. So over the years, I think EVA's confidences began to change, and of course that coincided with a greater awareness and reflexivity around curatorial discourse.
Question here. You encouraged us to make comments.
Yeah.
Because you were speaking just from a collection of slides, and you said that you're not bound by prepared speech. Could you please include in your commentary not only the statements of the curators in the invitation, tell us what they thought after the event. Okay.
Well, as far as I can, because my knowledge of this is not all that comprehensive. But Germano Salon, for instance, he wrote a report after his 1991 edition, and he was incredibly critical of EVA as an organisation at that time. He was critical because EVA was, the parameters that were given to him were one venue, and like one outdoor space, just as, and his complaint was that EVA should try and make itself or try and mobilize the opportunity for the whole city to be utilized in the presentation. And that actually did happen. So in the introduction to the following year's catalogue, there is mention actually of Germano's complaint, his criticism, and as a result, EVA began to work more and more in the public space. So you have an organisation that again is quite thin, and very much reflexive and responsive to the visions and experiences of these international curators. And that in turn began to develop the confidences of the organisation. It began to sort of introduce a sense of options. It changed the horizon of what the organisation could imagine itself being. Yeah, I mean, I'll try to say more about that a little later. In 2001 and 2002, the curators, I mean, related to the question and related to this point, some interesting things started happening. EVA began working much more outdoors, and the curatorial proposition became a much bigger part of what EVA was all about. 5 years previous, through Jan Hoyt's edition in 1994, EVA shifted from being solely an open submission model to a model that also had a channel for invited contributions. So these international curators, beginning with Jan Hoyt, would not only do the job of selecting work by Irish artists, but they would invite directly artists that they thought would contribute well to that context. The idea being that those two, I guess, like streams of entry, those Irish artists and those international artists, would kind of energize one another and provide context for one another, and ultimately be a kind of developmental mechanism for Irish art in the country. I mean, it's questionable as to how well that worked, but that has existed really from 1994 up until 2018, actually. We still operate an open call process for international artists, but the curator is given the option to invite artists into the program. So of course that began to completely change the landscape, and it began to change the look and the texture of the biennial. So from 1994 onwards, more international artists were present in Limerick. I mean, the resources were so small that often their contributions were quite minor, but there are some really interesting examples. I mean, one of Felix Gonzalez's Torres's last works was in Limerick. There's a series of lights that struggled across the main shopping street. I mean, it's a very beautiful work, and I think there's one photograph of it in existence, as far as we know. So these very, very beautiful and very modest examples of the international art context being kind of made manifest within this small working class town of 95,000 people. I mean, I find it quite affecting and quite beautiful. So in 2001 and 2002, some interesting things started happening from my perspective, and again thinking about the biennial not just as a vessel, but as a set of infrastructures that might be more proactive in developing the form or the artistic development of the country. Initiatives were introduced that replaced the prize-giving mechanism. So instead of giving out prizes, the curators were involved in actually brokering relationships so that artists, through the open submission process, Irish artists, were then given the opportunity to produce work abroad through the networks of those curators, or be given residencies, again through the networks of those curators. So built into the curatorial process, what started happening from 2001 onwards was this sense of actually developing the opportunities for young Irish artists. And EVA, I mean, the works were quite modest in terms of their, production costs, but it became more confident within the city, and there were more instances of risk taking and public works. So I'm going to sort of jump ahead.
And you had the
Sorry.
Zupanc. You just
Yeah.
showed Zupanc's work.
Yeah, this is a really important piece that was commissioned by Guy Tortosa in 2000. I think it was Guy Tortosa in 2002. So it was this is a 10-second explosive performance that took place on the river. So there's just a number of lines of gunpowder that were basically lit across the river, and the movement of those explosions went against the tide, which was kind of part of
He's
the
the
point.
artist who did the Olympics fireworks in Beijing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is one of those examples that I think is kind of EVA at its best,
Yeah.
where you have, in a way, artists of his is. Sorry, I've got his name wrong.
Yeah, it's fine.
Artists that were, just had actually also had the experience to develop something like this. I don't think that can be underestimated either. The scale of opportunity to produce work in the public sphere or to produce work of scale just didn't exist in Ireland at that time. In fact, it still doesn't really exist. So examples like this really did a lot to sort of change the compass and change the horizon for Irish artists.
Just a small remark, he was recently asked by city of Astana in Kazakhstan to do fireworks for 20 years anniversary of city.
Okay.
And he asked for 100,000 euros fee.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they didn't do it at the end. But,
Well, I should show them this, because this probably
Yes.
costs about 500
Yeah,
500 euros.
Yeah.
So I'm going to basically jump ahead to more recent editions. Everything that we've seen so far is was EVA within an annual model. Everything we've seen so far is been EVA without any employed staff at all. It's a voluntary board and an invited curator, and then basically just lots of grassroots activity, just trying to scramble it all together. But in 2012, this is actually a slide from 2014, but in 2012, EVA was subject to review from the Arts Council in Ireland, who remain its primary funder, who were demanding that the organisation just clean itself up and become a bit more professional and become much more strategic in the way that it was thinking. Because as I said, there wasn't much of an organisation to think of. It was really steered in each and every edition by the vision of each curator. So in 2012, it did that. They appointed a director for the first time, who in turn put together a team. There was a bigger fundraising effort, diversifying its funding so it wasn't just solely reliant on the Arts Council. It also significantly became a biennial model. And of course that does everything in terms of changing the scope of possibility. We were able to stretch our resources more. We were able to work with artists over a longer period of time. We were able to develop partnerships both in terms of production and in terms of fundraising. And it's interesting actually, even in the exercise of just putting these slides together, kind of seeing these new additions in relation to some of the old editions, where I feel like we've gained a lot actually in the kind of new mode of working and being much more slick and professional and actually appointing a graphic designer and doing these kind of things. But I think there's something of the kind of the energy or the kind of liveness or that complete guesswork that was done in those earlier editions that has somehow got lost and is sort of missing from the model as we currently have it. And I'm hoping to do something about that, of course. Agitationism was a project curated by Bassam Alberoni, who at the time was living in Egypt, and Berlin, and this was a very important project to me. And even prior to my involvement as director, I was very aware of this project, and it was something I followed very closely. I even reviewed it for Freedom magazine. And agitationism was meant to respond to a world that was somehow perennially caught in a state of anxiety and frenzy and headlessness. Agitation, political agitation, psychological agitation. These things were part of the kind of new, like, permanent condition, basically, of the world that we were living in. And this exhibition included some, I think, very interesting works that connected Ireland's or Limerick's, I guess, like, conservative traditions and its kind of lax infrastructure with something that permeated that and challenged that, but also sort of dealt with it with a certain amount of respect and understanding. So this is Anne-Sophie Sedan's installation in the Hunt Museum. The Hunt Museum is a small municipal gallery that mainly has a kind of a random collection of historical artifacts that were gifted by an Anglo-Irish family. And Anne-Sophie's installation was 9 monitors that just presented the like CCTV cameras of this pub called Costellos, which is like a famous student hangout that's open from like 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. So it's against all of this very delicate china and this very kind of stuffy environment, was just all sorts of scenes of like vomit and mayhem and all sorts of like ugliness going on. But it was a very kind of blunt but very beautiful commentary and juxtaposition that I think very much suited kind of Ireland's horizons at that time. Still the Barbarians. This is Koyo, who in 2016 put this very, very ambitious project together. Still the Barbarians was the title. This was the 37th edition. And this is a project that I very much refer to still. It included a huge number of commissions, and an awful lot was produced in terms of artistic production, but also in terms of like research and knowledge development around the themes of the exhibition, which were all about coming from an African context. We're all about seeing Ireland much more as a post-colonial country, and she really presented that as a proposition and as a challenge to Ireland to kind of wake up to itself as a post-colonial country, where there's still a history. There's a history within the country of land repossession. There's history of systematic abuse. There's a history of systematic racism. All of these things actually that we that are clear markers of like the colonial conditions that we identify in other parts of the world. We're kind of there in Ireland, but so embedded and so deeply part of the psyche that they're almost impossible to address. So Still the Barbarians was a very important project in seeking to address that. My one criticism of the project, actually, of Still the Barbarians, is that it kind of addressed Ireland's post-coloniality as actually a discourse rather than actually kind of as a kind of method somehow. Like in those slides that I presented earlier, those examples of that quite symptomatic modernist work that's kind of anachronistic and out of place, I mean, in a way, that's also part of Ireland's post-colonial condition. And I think, I think any serious and rigorous conversation around Ireland's post-coloniality needs to take that on as well. So this is the Biennial that happened this year. This was curated by Inti Guerrero, and it was a project that had no title. He just called it the 38th EVA International, which itself broke a tradition that was then 15, 20 years old, of the biennials each having a title that would basically lead a thematic premise. But Inti decided to have no title, and in fact he imagined the whole project as a sort of network, or as a series of looping smaller exhibitions, like clusters that were then connected and could be read in relation to one another. What he didn't want to do was do a kind of monolithic exhibition with a kind of an academic preface and then just a whole lot of artwork to illustrate it. He wanted to do something much more intertextual. So this took place earlier this year, 2018, and it finished in July, and we're still doing some of the kind of the wrap-up work on it. The whole exhibition was not based, but kind of compassed by this painting by Sean Keating called Night Candles Are Burnt Out. And this painting was included as part of the exhibition, and was a kind of motor or a kind of catalyst for Inti's kind of connected thinking about the biennial overall. Sean Keating is well known in an Irish context. He's hanging in all the kind of major collections that exist now. But he's almost as famous for being a nationalist, which in an Irish context means kind of Republican. He's famous for being a nationalist, with very firm ideas about what Ireland should be and what Irish art should be, and very much anti-British in his sentiments. So he kind of produced his work in this sort of social realist approach, and he very much rejected the move towards abstraction that he saw coming down the line. So this painting, Night Candles Are Burnt Out, is a painting of, it's a kind of tableau of Irish society in front of this building of the Ardnacrusha hydroelectric dam. I mentioned this dam in one of my first slides. So this is a dam it still exists. It's just north of the River Shannon that flows through Limerick. It's just a few miles away. And as I said, it was the first major piece of civil engineering developed by the Irish state. It cost 1/5 of the entire state budget. It could supply enough electricity, where it could oversupply electricity by 3 times the demand at the time in Ireland. So it was a huge undertaking that was a strategic undertaking by the Irish state, designed to modernise and electrify the country. And of course, what that means, what electrification means in a country like Ireland, is modernism. It's about synchronising experience. It's about bringing rural context closer to urban context. It's about ensuring that industry works efficiently. That's kind of what electricity can do. But of course, a hydroelectric dam is also something else. It's actually in the business of turning the kind of natural force of water into electricity. And Ireland, with its kind of agrarian history and with its kind of self-identification with landscape, this was a significant move. The other detail, I'm kind of a bit obsessed by this dam, so I can just talk about it endlessly. But another kind of important detail was that it was built in partnership with Siemens, who were a German company. Which, if you think this is 1926, so Europe is just like in a complete mess, and for Ireland to partner with like Britain's old enemy, the Germans, was hugely symbolic. So there were 3,000 German workers that were brought over for the construction of this dam. There were even schools for German families that were established in the County Clare region in order to be able to facilitate those workers' families. You know, very interesting kind of political alignment in the process of this dam. So the painting shows this kind of tableau of Irish society that are all somehow like that on the you know, they're hanging on the balance of this dam. There's a kind of capitalist developer in the foreground. There's a Republican soldier. There's some drunk workers. There's the skeleton of what we assume to be of a British military soldier. There's a priest, and there's a young family kind of pointing at the horizon. So I think Sean Keating was fascinated by the dam and fascinated by the prospect of Ireland's potential in the midst of this change. And this painting became a kind of catalyst and became a way of Inti approaching the entire biennial in one way or another. And sometimes it was kind of explicit, and sometimes it was less explicit. You include works like Bruce Conner, a very important artist, American artist. This work from the 70s called Angels, which is a series of photograms using his own body. So interconnecting ideas of electricity and light with ideas that connect to Catholicism and religious symbolism. He also included work like Maini Gellat, whose paintings are hanging on the back of this image, who was a kind of cubist, like a religious cubist, Irish painter that was very influenced by her time in Paris in the early 20th century. The images of the Virgin Mary and those kinds of things that applied in a kind of cubist logic. It's very strange and interesting work. And again, more works that kind of connected to ideas of light and what light is as a kind of form of empowerment, or as a kind of almost as a process of colonization also. So works by Gonzalo Fornmeyer, which are based on the interiors of European plantation owners in South America. And this work by Stephen Cohen, which is a performance video work where he dresses up as a chandelier and walks through like a slum in Johannesburg. You know, again, light, electricity, illumination as a colonizing process, or as a process of social and cultural enlightenment. And the work also, the biennial also connected to like ecological themes in a much more direct way. This is John Gerard's Solar Reserve, which, if you like, is a kind of an update of the Ardnacrusha Dam. It's actually, if you know John Gerard's work, he produces very high-spec simulations, computer programs, based on real situations. So this is a solar battery. This image is of a work, like a big black box projection, back projection. There's a simulation, a 365-day simulation of a solar battery that exists in the Nevada desert. It's a real thing. And John Gerard's work is it's basically like a drone camera that moves around the site of this battery, and corresponds to the changing weather conditions and changing light conditions of the day and night. But also ideas of electricity and technology taken a few steps further. This work by Sam Kyo, which came as a result of a residency that we were able to develop for Sam in Silicon Valley, so we spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley researching actually the history of the Winchester, the Winchester rifle. You know, it's a famous rifle, but the family that's basically produced that weapon have a museum in California, and it's a kind of crazy museum that was designed by I think the granddaughter of the Winchester family, and it's in her kind of slightly schizophrenic state, created this mess of a building full of all sorts of architectural styles, and she kind of basically employed a bunch of carpenters for a kind of 10-year process, like permanently just adding bits to the building and making this and doing that, and it just became this kind of huge Frankenstein. And Sam's interest in that house was seeing that architecture as a kind of process of like guilt or something to do with the kind of hauntings of the death caused by that rifle, connected also to its context within Silicon Valley and the kind of latent threats that exist in the internet and through technological advancements. If nothing else, I'm also just giving you a sense of some of the spaces that we work in. We don't have any permanent venue. We regularly use a space called the Cleves Dairy Factory, which is here, and also where John Gerard's work was installed. And it's one of the few buildings in Limerick that is a large-scale post-industrial space. But we also use the Hunt Museum, the Limerick City Gallery, a small municipal gallery, as well as other sites in every edition. One notable thing about the 38th EVA International was that it coincided with the referendum to repeal the 8th Amendment. This made kind of international news, and so I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, but Ireland's constitution was developed at a time when Ireland was very much under the grip of the Catholic Church, and there are still many things in the constitution that directly relate to that connection. In fact, only yesterday, the day before yesterday, was there a referendum to remove blasphemy actually from the constitution, which was successful. You'll be glad to hear. The biennial coincided with this referendum to repeal the 8th Amendment. The 8th Amendment basically is a detail in the Constitution that gives equal rights to the unborn, to the mother and the unborn, which basically provides the rationale for abortion to be illegal in almost all circumstances. So this, of course, has been like an ongoing issue for a lot of human rights groups and women's groups for many, many, many years. But a referendum was called for May this year, and we were aware that the biennial was going to coincide with it. So INTI made a number of choices that directly aligned with that referendum. It's quite difficult to communicate just how what it felt like on the ground during the campaign in the immediate weeks to the referendum. This was taking place in a kind of post-Trump, post-Brexit context, where in a way you just don't really know what the public is anymore. In a way, you just don't know what shape it or what was how it could be leveraged or steered by forces unknown. So the environment was incredibly tense over the month leading up to this referendum. There was shock imagery that was being used by a lot of American-funded anti-abortion campaigners outside schools and roundabouts. It was really very, very much part of the everyday experience for a few weeks in Ireland, and it was very difficult. And we were also sort of threatened as an organisation, and all of our funders were contacted by anti-abortion campaign groups, asking them if they supported our decisions and all of this kind of stuff. So it was very difficult also from an organisational perspective. But this I guess is a really good example of what a biennial can do, and we were a very loud piece of the campaign, really, for the Repeal the Eighth Amendment group. And this artist collective called the Artist Campaign to Repeal the Eighth Amendment organised this enormous street procession that took place through the city of Limerick, and it was a procession that was structured around historical sites of abuse, basically, the Magdalene laundries and a number of different religious institutions. And in anticipation of this procession, we were able to get like Guardian and UK national and tabloid journalists involved in covering this story and covering the campaign. So the biennial and the campaign were quite synonymous at a certain period of time. I mean, I'm not going to. It's important to say, of course, it was a broad-based effort. But ourselves and Project Art Centre in Dublin were one of a few organisations that were very publicly aligning themselves to the repeal effort. So this repeal march took place through Limerick City, using kind of banners that were designed by the various artists that were involved in the campaign. And those banners were subsequently presented in I guess a more traditional exhibition context. Alongside those banners was a number of rooms that presented archival material and research material and documentaries and stories that related to the referendum campaign. So they kind of imagined it. We were able to give them about 200 square meters of space and adjoining rooms to develop a kind of research or kind of hub for the campaign. Where people could research the issues, and there were books there, and there was all sorts of information just also about the referendum process itself. There was also work in the biennial that kind of connected to those themes in less direct ways, but was somehow also very, very significant. Sani Ivakovic, of course, Lady Rosa of Luxemburg, which is a work that has been shown in numerous occasions, and of course very much emerged out of a very specific context of commemorating soldiers, First World War soldiers. But in an Irish context, it did something else again, of course, because it couldn't help but speak to the issues of the referendum and of gender injustice and the relationship between gender, or relationship between patriarchy and the state. The work consists of this large plinth. You're not seeing the base of it, unfortunately, but this large plinth with a kind of gold statue holding a wreath, but she's visibly pregnant, and on the base of the plinth, a series of posters that Sanya's curated that I guess like signpost different ideologies and denigrations of feminism. Madonna, bitch, virgin, whore, these kinds of ideas. So this was presented in this like car park of this industrial site, and it did all sorts of things for us that were very, very interesting and kind of incidental. One thing that you don't really kind of get the sense of with this image is that it was viewable from across the city. And Ireland actually doesn't have any kind of figurative ceremonial sculpture at all, in a way. It was all destroyed when the British got kicked out. So actually, just even seeing something gold and tall and ceremonial within the fabric of an Irish city was actually quite unusual. So it became it was one of the first works that we installed within the Biennial, so it became kind of infectious in the way that people were encountering it before really understanding what it was, and that really also helped generate the kind of momentum around the issues that we were trying to address. That work was presented alongside a media archive that now accompanies the work wherever it's shown, which just documents the controversy that has been built around the presentation of the work in various other contexts. I just sort of flicked through a couple more images. I'm aware I'm running out of time, believe it or not. Included work by John Duncan, who for the last 20 years has been documenting Belfast, which is his home city, in quite a sort of topographic approach. Particularly in this example, these bonfires that are produced by Protestant loyalists to mark. I can't even remember my history.
July 16th.
July 16th, yeah. The 12th. They're very much present. In Belfast and in the estates where of those communities, and they're used as to message a lot of their political ideology. They're often covered with, you can see this one covered in the Irish flag or posters of Republican politicians. There are others in the series where it actually includes the European flag. So. They put all that on the bonfire in order to burn it kind of ceremoniously, and yeah, it's for anyone that's kind of not familiar with Northern Ireland. It's actually quite a spectacle and quite a force to behold. These pictures on the right are actually the council's attempt to actually manage the ongoing bonfires. So they created these sort of like flame stations, which kind of honour the event, but somehow don't let it get messy. But of course, all that happens is both things happen, actually. Like, that gets burned and that gets burned. It's just like more things on fire. But yeah, there was a sort of subsection within his idea of the Biennial as a set of clusters. There was a subsection of work that was connected to the North and to anti-Irish and anti-Republican sentiment. So it also included work by artists like really famous in the mid-90s, artists like Rita Duffy, that had approached these themes, in her case, through a figurative tradition. And it also included this, I think it's just on a personal level, I just love this work by an artist called Lockie Morris, who is an artist from Northern Ireland, who I think is one of the most unsung artists, actually, within the Irish context. This is a work from 1992, actually, that was, which is important, of course, because it's before the Good Friday Agreement. And it's a work called Comms, and it just exists of these kind of grotesque wall sculptures that look like enlarged pieces of chewing gum or look like bits of body. They're actually made of toilet paper and cling film, and then variously burnt with a lighter. And these comms, these refer to the process of communication in Republican prisons where prisoners would communicate both within the prison and beyond the prison by writing notes on bits of toilet paper and then rolling them up and then wrapping them in cling film and then burning them and then just putting them kind of between their teeth and exchanging them during visits, during family visits, like through a kiss or through a tongue. That's how so much communication was happening in the Republican prisons, during the 70s and 80s and even the 90s. So Lockie's work is, in the most basic way, a kind of an enlargement of those forms. So he uses the same materials, and he kind of brings those forms together as kind of cajoling bodies or cajoling tongues. There's also something kind of incredibly sexual that's about these works. They look so fleshy, and you get just and it was presented also with work by Roy Dibb and Marlon Riggs, who's a very important black filmmaker, specifically around black gay identity in the States. So within this kind of cluster, Lockie's work did something very, very extraordinary. Not only did it speak to this process of communication during in the Republican prisons, but it somehow sexualized that or challenged that through kind of an axis of sexuality and homosexuality, which I think was probably more controversial than anything actually that we than the work was intended to do. So again, I think this is a kind of also a really good example of what a biennial can also do. It can complicate issues. I mean, dealing with themes of republicanism and prisons and those political identifications can be tricky enough, but to actually take that on and extend that through another axis completely of sexuality, I think that is something that a biennial can do. And it can, of course, use history, it can use kind of the discursive intensity in order to do that. I've just been sort of rambling on, and I hope I've been able to make some kind of sense between the noise of it all, but I just wanted to actually end by talking a little bit about some of the plans for the 2020 biennial and some of the kind of rationale around these plans. I kind of explained at the very beginning of this presentation that one of the frustrations I have as a director of the organisation is that so much of the organisation has been historically very passive to the vision of a visiting curator, and of course that visiting curator has empowered us in all sorts of ways, but after 40 years of being in existence, there's very little that we have as an organisational legacy or in terms of curatorial knowledge or in terms of curatorial research. So the future model of the biennial, in the way that we've designed it, is that we're going to take a much more leading position in developing the curatorial framework ourselves. So beginning with a broad thematic design, which for 2020 will be the Golden Vein, and the Golden Vein was a 19th century description for the region and for the agricultural bounty of the region that then became a kind of brand of condensed milk. And that's a way of speaking about kind of land use and land rights, and you know, the body as metaphor, and actually also Limerick's own reputations over the 20th century, which have gone from which have been troubled by deep social problems and by significant drug issues in the city, and somehow this theme of Golden Vein kind of can connect to all of that. So the biennial framework is going to use a thematic that we kind of put forward that's loose enough to allow many things to happen within it, but is somehow still communicable and still has enough teeth for us to begin developing and begin fundraising around and begin developing partnerships for. But into that framework, we're then going to continue appointing an international curator, which for 2020 is going to be Barbarians, who's a young independent curator who's recently left a position, a senior programmer within SALT in Istanbul. And Merv is very much interested in themes of environmentalism and gender politics, and specifically the relationship between the two. So we're changing from a situation where the entire program framework is just given to the invited curator to design, now to a situation where we have a bit more control over that program framework, and it's going to mean all sorts of advantages in terms of being able to develop like longer term partnerships and programs, and actually maintain some kind of operational consistency from one biennial to the next. The other thing that we're going to do is we're finally going to kind of change our open call process. So that's been there from the beginning, and it's kind of a bit of an anachronism in a way. It was originally designed to give opportunities to artists and to be democratic, but having been inside that process, it just doesn't really work like that, and it doesn't reflect actually either curatorial methodology in terms of best practice, nor does it reflect the best practice in Ireland. So we're turning that into an initiative called Platform Commissions, which is separate to the guest curator program, even though the guest curator will be part of the panel that selects it. And that is explicitly for new work, and it's explicitly for artists that are based in Ireland. And that's really our attempt to do something that I think EVA has kind of hinted on over the years, but has just never fully achieved. And that is be like the major commissioning institution for contemporary art in Ireland. Ireland has a production incapacity. If you're ambitious and you make complex work, complex in terms of its theoretical intents, complex in terms of its technicalities, the resources just aren't there in Ireland, and neither are the budgets. So this Platform Commissions is an attempt for us to actually kind of almost install that infrastructure into the country. I mean, there's so much that I've just been sort of talking kind of like headlessly for the last hour or so. So I'm not even sure what I've said or what I've missed out or what I plan to say. But if you have any questions,
I will pass the mic. Do you have any questions or reflections?
Well, you did a very good job of speaking quite coherently. I've a lot of questions. Let's start with briefly. What sort of budget would you be? I don't need that. Oh, pardon. What sort of budget would you be working on, or towards, let's say, this 2020, or what were you working on in 2018?
So, for the biennial cycle, it's a total of about 800,000. Yeah, which makes us a small scale biennial. Yeah, I mean, if you think Liverpool biennial, what are they? 12,000? 12 million? 12 million. So I mean, we, and it's only their 10th edition or something like this. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to kind of get it up to speed. And that funding has kind of remained quite consistent over the last 10 years. And I hope within this new model where we begin to feel like an institution a little bit more, it's going to open other opportunities for us to get funding through the Arts Council, through the department, and other channels. That's the plan.
So just one of the brief questions, and totally random question to probably have. Why did it start in Limerick?
Well, I guess that's where the committee were at the time. I mean, the national context at the time was that there was this attempt by central government in the 60s to develop a big international exhibition, and this was called ROSC. It started in '66, I think, and this was very much of the model of you basically fly in the arts and you fly in the the curator to select it, and it was presented in the RDS or something like this, which is a big kind of exhibition hall in Dublin. So that was going on in Dublin from the late 60s onwards. And people were very, very aware of it. So EVA was kind of, I guess, catalyzed into action because it probably wanted something like that for itself. Yeah.
Actually, I only heard of EVA this year through the referendum.
Okay.
That's
good.
Let's say, yeah, it was.
Makes my point.
Yeah, it was publicised in the Guardian, the photographs of the story about the art. I founded and organised an Irish cultural exhibition here every year called Belgrade Irish Festival, and I suffer from sort of provincialism that let's say this organisation started with.
Yeah.
I didn't quite get what strategies you're. I mean, I can think I hear what you say, but I don't quite have a firm fit on where. I understand that problem, if you like, of provincialism, of presenting something just for the sake of exceptionalism in a local environment. Haven't quite found a other strategy, but just to mention, I've asked and I've invited, and he's accepted John Gerard, and he's due to come here into March 2019.
I hope you have a big enough budget.
I think we're going to rely on projectors and a good server.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
To continue about budgets, we heard that the budget is small in an absolute sense. How big or small is it in a relative sense? Is the city of Limerick spending much money on other public projects and then giving you a small fraction? Or is it generally a poor city and therefore you get little?
We don't get anything from the city. Well, we get 10,000, which is the same that they give to almost all other festivals, big and small, in the city. So most of our money comes from the Arts Council and from independent fundraising. I mean, there's a huge bit of work that we're trying to do in trying to get the city more involved. But I was actually talking to a number of Biennial directors a couple of days ago, and one of those directors runs a project in Sweden that's almost entirely funded by the city. And that has actually caused them all sorts of issues because they're very much led by the changing whims of the council. It's very much, the Biennial is very much written into the kind of touristic agendas of the city and what the city is trying to do strategically, touristically, and also in terms of business development. Actually, we don't have any of that accountability. Like, we're funded by the Arts Council primarily, which means that ultimately our responsibilities are about the artist and are about art form development and are about audiences for art. And in a way, that's a good place to be. Yeah. So at a municipal level, the funding we get from the city council is the same that they give to the, I don't know, like the fireworks or whatever. Yeah, they don't really think about us at all. At a national level, there are other projects like the Galway Arts Centre, which is a more multidisciplinary festival, mainly driven by performance and live arts. That runs a budget of about 4 million. But we're a major project within the visual arts portfolio of the Arts Council.
I presume among these invited artists there are expatriates from Ireland.
Yeah.
If you can generalize, what do these expat Irish artists think about the artistic scene in their mother country, and how are they received by their counterparts who have stayed in Ireland?
I don't really know what they think. I mean, the fact that they're living elsewhere says something, I suppose, in itself. As I said on this last slide, I mean, there is a production capacity in Ireland, so there's not enough really to sustain practice. If it's, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate either. There are many artists in Ireland that are functioning and working very well and doing really good things, but but I think the horizon of opportunity is is quite limited, and that there are definitely other contexts that you can operate in that will improve your opportunities to produce work and to exhibit the work and get that international visibility. But actually, the question that you ask is kind of confusing to answer because it's so fluid. Actually, the diaspora and its relationship back to Ireland is incredibly fluid. So often you don't even know. There's lots of artists, for instance, that live in have some kind of foothold in Ireland, but also kind of live in Berlin, and they make best of that situation. The Arts Council in Ireland is also reasonably generous. In fact, a lot of the public funding in Ireland is reasonably generous and respects the diaspora. So you don't necessarily need to be living in Ireland in order to be able to draw down on bursary funding and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I would like to ask you. I think your presentation here in Belgrade is pretty relevant because of October Salon, because I think October Salon had a very similar history, being an annual exhibition and quite late turning into biennial, when actually biennial started losing its relevance. And we started questioning what's the difference between biennial and the museum exhibitions, because they look the same. And I think what we discussed maybe earlier today is that you're actually proposing maybe to rethink the new model of how biennial might work from this one, turning it into an institution that kind of is reflecting on its history, on its curatorial knowledge, but also kind of connecting to the local community. How do you imagine to kind of reactivate those processes? Because biennial usually is always focused around this main exhibition that kind of lands in the local context at the 2 months time, and then that's pretty much it, and draws all the focus into this exhibition. Whether you're planning to activate certain processes throughout all these 2 years in order to kind of negotiate this new possible model of working around biennial, or maybe you can discuss a little bit that.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, and again, in this conversation I was having recently with other biennial directors, I think we all feel that like a lot of the things that biennials were designed to do has now just been either possible by other institutions, or they're notions that are kind of now a little corrupt. 10 years ago, being international was a kind of virtue in itself. It stood for something, and now it's suspect, and people either accuse it, of elitism or neoliberalism. It's not a word that necessarily has any kind of positive connotations. So for us, actually, EVA International is kind of written into our title, so we're kind of a little trapped. But it's more just about like what the relations actually, and prioritizing relations rather than actually prioritizing transactions. There's a slight difference somehow. Internationalism prioritizes your ability to kind of reach and connect and that sort of stuff. And for anyone that's running an arts organization, big and small, you can achieve a lot of that with a bit of savvy PR. Actually, that's what's changed for biennials in the last 10 years, is that you can actually achieve internationalism quite easily. And we see this in even small project spaces. Internationalism is not hard to achieve. You can kind of actually buy your way into it through marketing, or you can plug certain networks. So for us as a biennial, it's now thinking like, shit, we don't have that we can rely on. We don't have that to distinguish ourselves. So what are the relationships and what are the values that we can kind of reinstall? And another thing that's kind of a problem for biennials is that they were previously this process or events of like discursive intensity. So you would, with a biennial came a proposition around particular ideas and themes, and they would pack the program full of talks and seminars and these kinds of things. And now, as we know, we're here having a conversation in an art institution, but art institutions, big and small, are doing similar things. So yeah, again, it comes back to this question of like what can the biennial do, and what could it, what are its new values? For us, it's about relations, and we believe you can have a different relationship as a biennial, like in compared to other arts organisations and platforms. We don't have a venue, so we're not like running around trying to find plumbers or trying to pay rent that is escalating or whatever. Like, we have an opportunity to kind of institute ourselves flexibly and develop relationships with both artists and partners, like over long periods of time. And I think that's what the biennial will seek to do. But to answer your question in another way, there's details which might be too technical and kind of boring to mention, but they're important. But we will have more control over the kind of core identity of the organisation. Whereas previously the invited curator was very much involved in picking a designer and creating a sort of exhibition brand, which is great, and it can create all sorts of like new energies and visibilities around the project. But it does mean that every 2 years it kind of resets, and you kind of each subsequent edition like disappears the previous. You know, there's no kind of institutional memory that's kind of maintained. And so by having a bit more control over the core sort of brand of the project, we begin to change that institutional memory. And then there's other things. What else was I going to talk about? There are other things that we're doing. So although the biennial program culminates in a 10-week exhibition every 2 years, there's like ongoing programs, particularly around public programs and educational activities. So we're doing a program called Better Words, which is going to be happening next year, with school children in the region to get them thinking and developing new word forms or art terminology, basically, that is using their own kind of vernacular. We're also doing programming around our archive. So one of the ideas that we've sketched in for next year is basically to do a biennial that it's really just actually a walking tour of previous events and exhibitions and performances and presentations that have taken place over the years. So it would be a kind of a walking tour that of a kind of fictional biennial. So these are some of the kind of almost like tactics that we're going to be employing over the year. Another important detail that doesn't quite relate to what you're asking, but is nonetheless important, is that we're going to change we're going to try and de-emphasize the word exhibition, because I think it actually causes all sorts of problems and limits on what we can do and the way that we engage with audiences as well. I think it actually limits our abilities to speak to a wide audience, to be quite honest. Because the exhibition, of course, is, as we know, like a 19th century notion. It comes with a certain set of behaviours and comportments, and so we want to kind of shift the language slightly into thinking more about encounters, and that kind of in a slight way make a huge difference in terms of the way that we think about our programs. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions?
Am I allowed to ask a short question of the audience, not of the speaker?
Yes.
Please raise your hand if you are an employee of a public institution in Serbia. If you work for a public institution, just identify yourself. I'd like to talk briefly with two of the three who identified themselves.
I think maybe we do it
Privately.
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry.
Good idea. Good idea.
not okay.
suggest?
Maybe to talk privately.
Yes, privately.
Privately.
No, 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 I
We
want-
exchange
no,
privacy
no, no,
is
no, I want to talk with them privately after the.
Do you have any other questions?
For
Besides
Matt?
asking for employment? For Matt or? No?
Thank you then very
Thank you.
much for sharing this, and I think you should really follow it because I hope they will propose some different models working around biennial as a format.
Mm.
And I would like to thank Irish Embassy in Greece for supporting Matt to come here, and EVA International to being so open to work with us to make this happen, and Consulate of Ireland here in Belgrade. And I would like to thank Saša Tkačenko, who is not with us tonight, but he actually produced the new flag for Matt's talk. And our school is going to have a last public lecture on 8th of November by WCSCD, a curatorial collective from Croatia. So please come for that. Thank you very much. Thank you.